without further ado, we're very pleased to introduce you all to Ms. Trudy Curtis. Trudy, it's all yours.
Thanks, Talbot. I really appreciate it. I hope everybody can hear me okay. And Talbot, you can just message me if I become broken up or anything. We had a little trouble with the phone before. So I'm really glad to have a chance to talk to everybody about some of the issues that we have with well status and classification. And I don't know how many of you have experience in the oil and gas industry, but I thought I'd just spend a minute or so and just to kind of update you about exactly what the problem is and how challenging it is for us. So as an organization, we have these terms that we use for well status and classification, and as Talbot said, we use that information to group or collate sets of information so that we can find them easily and get them plotted on a map. So if you were a user, you might want to find all of the wells that are producing oil and get them on a map, or all the wells that are currently in a drilling program, or all the wells that have been proposed but haven't started drilling yet. And it's a good way to help us to display information on a map. And then users typically create plot symbols and associate those symbols with various terms, different well status terms. And we found that there's just a huge amount of inconsistency in the terminology that's being used by industry, not just locally in areas like the United States or in Canada, but internationally within regulatory agencies, within software applications, within particular companies. Almost everybody's developed their own standard for well status. And for those of you who haven't heard before, standards are like toothbrushes, because everybody has one and nobody wants to use anybody else's. And that's been a really big problem with us right now. So the consequence is that users and organizations, when they see a term, they assume that that term means what they're accustomed to it meaning, instead of the meaning that is intended by the user. And that creates a lot of problems with misunderstanding and confusion. Regulatory reporting and compliance can be quite difficult. When we talk about terms like suspended well, the regulatory definition of what they mean by a suspended well is very different. So using a single word like suspended creates a lot of ambiguity. We can make some poor decisions, and mapping data and so on can be really significant problems for us. So industry came to us a few years ago and said, this is getting to be very difficult. Every regulatory agency has their own list of well statuses they want us to use. Every software vendor has a list that they want us to use. All of our mapping applications have different things that they want to use. Our own company has developed a list, and we have so many lists, and they're all so poorly defined that we have a really tough time figuring out what to do. So we formed a work group in about 2010 and began doing some analysis on this problem. And I'm kind of picking on IHS, and I know that they don't mind if I show them some of this information. But here's an example of some of the kind of information that you would see represented as well status from one of the major data vendors in the world. IHS is probably the largest single data vendor of oil and gas data anywhere in the world. And so they collect this information from many different places. And if you look at the kind of information, and I didn't pick and choose these values. All I did was take a screen cap of the first page worth of values. So they're all in alphabetical order. There's about 475 values or something, some number of values, and they all show the same kind of thing. So if you look at these values, the first thing that you can see is that each one of these is representing many different kinds of information. So for example, if you can see where my mouse is, 1W1SOW means there's one water injection and one service well workover with oil shows. Now that's conveying a whole lot of information, but it's hard to imagine any user asking to see with a special symbol all of the maps that have that particular status. In fact, when we use these values, we tend to have to search through them and parse through them to find all of the wells that are gas wells. So you can see that the word gas appears in many of these different well statuses. And if we wanted to create a map of all the gas wells, we'd have to somehow parse through all of these well statuses and sort them all out. And that's pretty difficult, particularly when you find that the way these values are being used by agencies is extremely variable. So if I take this and I go back into their simple database and I look at their database in a column that they call well classification, and I look to see what values they have in well classification, I see the value gas. So obviously gas is a kind of a well classification. As is gas well, so we're immediately puzzled why we have gas and gas well. Looks like some redundancy. And then we have an EXP gas well, which could be an expired or an exploratory or exploration gas well. We see NFW, New Field Wildcat, that usually stands for New Pool Wildcat. So you see variations in spelling and formatting and structure. New Pool Wildcat Expendable. So we get some financial information, lots of other values, and then we've got disposal wells, drilling waste disposal, hazardous waste disposal, non-nuclear, which is kind of an interesting one, and effluent disposal, which one boggles the mind if one wants to think what's in that. So if we look at this well status, you can see that the values in this are not atomic. They're conveying, again, more than one kind of information, and the values themselves are not mutually exclusive. So that makes searching this kind of information very, very difficult. So we went and had a look at another column called well status, and in there we found gas again, and gas well, only this time gas wells all in uppercase, producing, active, completed oil and gas, D, whatever that means, 301 WIW, OWOO, shutdown for Christmas, which I expect will happen any time now, and let me go back up there again. So again, you look at well status, and we see the same values that we saw in well classification. We see the same ambiguity, the same complex kinds of information being conveyed, and even more confusing about how it is that we go about looking for wells of different kinds. How do we find our gas wells, for example? It's just, it's very confusing. It's very, very complicated. So we went and looked at fluid type, same database. And we find in there, to nobody's surprise, gas and gas well, again, a gas injection well, a gas with oil shows, GTMDSW, which I defy you to remember that one, GTSTWOG, and so on. And again, the same confusion just happens again and again in all of these databases, and a lot of people suffer from that problem. So we see that problem with terminology, lack of clarity, lack of definitions. I've looked through many regulatory agency sites in terms of the terms that they use, and it's very rare that one finds a good, clear definition of what these things actually mean. And then we go ahead and we take these things and we attach them to plot symbols so that we can stick them on maps. So we want to map wells all the time. So I went online and I found a number of different mapping sites to see whether or not I could see any consistency in the symbology that's being used. So we have a look at this one, and you can see that there are a number of symbols. There's some big ones and some little spiders with long legs and things that look like drilling rigs and so on. And we have no legend with this map. We have the NPD, the Norwegian Petroleum Directorate, and they have, to our puzzlement, my boxes have slid a little bit, but they have an extensive legend that comes with this thing. And if you can see, there's for wellbore, there's production gas, there's another symbol for ejection gas, and there's another symbol for gas, and they are exactly the same symbol. So one wonders why they have the same symbol with 3 different legends. It's not clear how you're supposed to actually use that. The DNR in Ohio State, that's one of the regulatory agencies, has developed a symbol set, and then they've developed a series of symbols that they plot around that plot symbol to try to convey a bunch of additional information. So they do convey a ton of information here, but if you try to plot this information on a map, you end up with a tremendous amount of overposting problems, and it's tough for people to figure out how to use this. The American Petroleum Institute had a go at creating a set of plot symbols many years ago, and some of them are still in use, and some of them are really not in use anymore. I couldn't even find a current usage of those symbols. ESRI provides some plot symbols, but they provide them without any definitions. So any user can use any symbol they want, but they can attach any meaning to the symbols that they want or that they create. And that means that as you exchange maps, there can be some cognitive issues about what a symbol means. You have to keep going back and looking at the legend to make sure that the symbol means what you think it means. INTELLOG, there's a consulting company, tried to create another set of plot symbols, and as you can see, they're very complex and they have many different kinds of information with them. I haven't seen too much adoption of those. The Netherlands Oil and Gas website uses a completely different set of plot symbols. So if we have a look at the different kinds of symbols that we see, we can see most companies use some kind of a filled-in symbol for active oil wells, but source 3 makes it green, source 1 and 2 make it black, and source 4 adds a bunch of little spider legs to it, and source 5 just does numbers. For active gas wells, we see some similarity in the structure of the symbol, except the length of those little legs differs, and in one source, the little circle in the middle is filled in. So if you're plotting in black and white, for example, you get a little trouble telling the difference between oil and gas on source 4 because that's just color. Symbols for an active rig vary. Some don't have a symbol for that at all. For oil and gas, you can see source 2, oil trumps gas, so you get the oil symbol if it's both oil and gas. Source 3 creates a new combined symbol. And source 3, for some reason, uses the same symbol for coal bed methane as they do for an active rig, which is quite perplexing. So we got some really big issues. So the work group sat and they had a look at that and talked about whether or not we could create some baseline definitions for well status and classification information that we could use as a Rosetta Stone to help us to integrate multiple different symbol sets into each other, and then to be able to represent that information in a map. So to get started, we had a look at a concept called faceted taxonomies. Now, faceted taxonomies have been around in the records management world for probably a decade or so, and they're a mechanism that is used to classify information using very atomic principles. So any of you that have taken any biology studies, you'll remember the Linnaean classification system. And in the Linnaean classification system, we divide living things into vertebrates and invertebrates, plants and animals, birds and reptiles and amphibians. And each of those levels in the classification system is related to the level above it by using the term is a kind of. So a vertebrate, a bird is a kind of a vertebrate, a mammal is a kind of a vertebrate, and a fish is a kind of a vertebrate, and a dog is a kind of a mammal, a horse is a kind of a mammal, and a cow is a kind of mammal. So those kinds of atomic or classification taxonomies are extremely useful for helping us define things, and that's the principle that's used in faceted taxonomies. So if we can take that complex information and decompose it into its atomic constituent parts and then group these constituent elements into proper logical facets, it would be a lot easier for us to be able to sort out the information that we have for wells. So we continued to work in, There we go. So we looked at using this for well facets, and we found that we have a number of criteria that we can use that are very helpful. So a facet has clearly defined independent properties, and facets should contain values that are mutually exclusive with values in other facets. So when you go into one facet, there is one and only one value that makes sense for you to pick. And in the examples that we looked at earlier, in several cases, 2 or 3 or 4 of those values might be relevant to a particular well, in which case you have to make some kind of decision tree or create yet another concatenation. We recognize that facets may be hierarchical in nature, and by that I mean that a value in a facet may itself be the parent of another facet. And I'll show you some of that in a minute. Contents of facets may be dependent logically from a business perspective on other values, and there may be some qualifiers that we need to use. And we identify 2 kinds of facets that are associated with well information. The first is a state-based. That tells me where I am in a life cycle or in a process, and those are the kinds of facets values that can change over time. So these things tend to be pretty dynamic. The classification-based facets tend to change little, maybe occasionally over the life of a well, but not necessarily on a time basis, but more on what's happening to that well basis. So if we look at the state-based facets and the classification-based facets, we have some good mechanisms to help us to sort out information. So the work group identified 15 different kinds of information related to well status. Some of those facet values were related to the well, and that is the whole entity from the origin or surface of the well bore down to all of the well bores that are inside that well. Some of the statuses are really mostly relevant to a specific well bore or path of drilled footage within that well configuration. So we identified as a facet the business life cycle phase. We created a definition for that term to help people to understand what we mean. So in the well status, which is available online, by the way, the business life cycle phase is defined as are all of these things. Operatorship. Am I the operator of this well or not? What was my business intention for this well? What was the outcome? What's the Leahy classification? What kind of play was I in? Each one of these contains values that are atomic and mutually exclusive with each other. And I'll just show you a couple of examples of those. So my role, or the role of that well, can be to produce or to inject or to cycle. A cycling well will sometimes be producing and sometimes be injecting. It might be a surface well, could be a mineral well. That would be very common, for example, in the oil sands in northern Alberta. We might have a wellbore that has no current role. It might be a research well or an observation well where I'm just taking some readings. If it's an injection well, it could also be classified underneath that as being non-conventional. If it's a service well, there's a subfacet. It says, well, if I'm service, am I a supply well? Am I a storage well? Or am I a disposal well? For the wellbore status, we identified then where we are in the life cycle of the well. Have I established the location? Am I drilling? Have I got it drilled encased? Am I completing? Am I producing, injecting, etc.? But that tells me where I am in the life cycle. So the one in green is more static, less likely to change. The one in blue is likely to change over the life of that well. The fluid type facet is fairly complex, as you can imagine. Different regulatory agencies in the world have different requirements for the way fluid is reported. Some agencies want you to report to a fairly fine level of detail, and some want you to report just to a fairly high level aggregated detail. And even if you report to your regulatory agency at a fairly aggregated high level of detail, your partnership agreements or your royalty agreements may be based more on the composition of a particular product, in which case these subfacets became very important. So we have a fluid type, bitumen, condensate, gas, gas and condensate, etc. And we associate that with its cofacet, whether that is the primary fluid, a secondary fluid, whether there's just a show, or whether there's a trace of that particular fluid. If we take a particular fluid, like gas, for example, we can state that it's gas, and then we can further qualify down this list exactly what kind of a gas it is that we're dealing with. If it's a non-hydrocarbon gas, we can talk about exactly which kind of non-hydrocarbon gas, etc., etc. So certain of these values can be broken down, but only if that's something that's relevant to the user. Having done that, we created a website, and the website contains all of these terms and all of these definitions and all of the relationships to each other. Now you can take those very complex facets that you see, such as this example I put up here, abandoned combination oil and gas producer, and you can begin to decompose that value into the facets that are relevant. So this status says something about the business life cycle phase, about the fluid direction, about the fluid type, about the well status, and about the well bore status. And we can select the right value in each one of these facets to help us to define more precisely and more atomically and with better clarity what that well status value actually means. So we can decompose then all those complex values now into their atomic constituent parts and begin using the constituent parts. And if I have a look at a little spreadsheet I create, this is only a little subset. We took some of those complex values that we saw at the very beginning, spelled out their whole name so you can see what the whole thing means, and then broke out the primary fluid, the primary role. Each one of these is one of the facets, a primary fluid abundance, a secondary fluid, the secondary rules. We can begin breaking all of that down. And now you see that if you query down any one of these columns, the number of values that you see is much smaller and much, much easier to query. So what our members are doing now with this information is, as they get a new source of information, they're taking the complex information that they get and they're sitting down as a group and they're breaking all of that information down to its constituent parts so that they can reference the complex status where they need to, for example, for regulatory reporting, and they can break down that information in a little bit more detail for query purposes or for generating maps or for generating plot symbols. And that's been a very powerful concept for us to deploy. In the data model, so this is the PPDM data model, which is a data model that's used by a lot of our members for their master data management. We have created a set of tables into which you can populate all that information, and then this green table, our well status XREF in the middle, is the place where you can pre-populate all that decomposition and query the information as you need to. And a number of our members have already done that. So now we get into the next challenge. And the next challenge is so we've decomposed all of that information and we have got some clarity that some of that status information relates to this entire configuration that we see, and some of the status only would relate to a single tubing string or to a single path of drilled footage in this collection. But most people generate maps showing a single symbol at the origin or surface of the wellbore. So if you're going to create a surface symbol and you want to represent complex kinds of information, some of which might ultimately have been aggregated from the status of different wellbores, how do you represent that at the well origin? That's an interesting question, right? So if I have two wellbores that are producing gas and I have one wellbore that's producing oil, Does it get a gas symbol at the surface because it's producing gas, or does it get oil because oil is worth more money than gas, especially in Canada? So those are all questions that have to be discussed. And then we talk about whether everybody wants to see the same symbol set. We discovered when we did this that people have a tremendous amount of passion for the symbol sets that they've created themselves. They don't want to use anybody else's symbol sets, and they've got used to the ones that they've created, and they create these very long, convoluted, complex set of symbols that are very meaningful inside their company, but very difficult to use outside the company. So the work group, when they sat down, they said, maybe what we can do is start by creating a set of symbols that might help us to address 70 or 80% of the problem. So we begin by getting some common grounds in the biggest level of overlap, and then going forward, we can try to create some symbol sets that might get more and more refined and continue to add on to the symbol set over time. And that's what the work group decided to do. So they had a look at these facets and said, which facets are the ones that are most commonly used in creating the meaningful symbol that people are used to having see on their map. So they're accustomed to seeing where we are in the business life cycle phase. They really want to know what the outcome of the well was, whether it was a successful well or an unsuccessful well. They want to discern the fluid direction. They want to know which wells are injectors, which ones are producers. They want to know the fluid type, especially they want to know where the oil wells and the gas wells are. They want to know the well status, so they want to know the wells that are currently producing or wells that used to produce and are now abandoned, and we want to know what the wellbore status is. So they selected those and began creating some symbols based on a decision tree. So if you have a well that's in planning, maybe we can represent that with an open circle. If we've taken it from planning to drilling or completing, we can use an oil rig symbol, which people are very used to seeing. If we're finished that, we can look and see whether or not the well was successful or whether it was unsuccessful. If that well was unsuccessful, we can look to see whether it was dry, whole, or whether that was undetermined or a last hole, create symbols associated with those. And if the well is successful, tell us whether or not we drilled and cased it. Did we reclaim that well? Is it plugged and abandoned? And if it's currently producing, some other symbols. And we took those symbols and we mapped them in the facets. And we have found one gap, and as we go through the revision, we're going to find that, fill that gap up. Then we created an intersection set of tables representing where we are with the wellbore status. Is it producing, injecting, shut in, suspended, or abandoned? And what is the fluid type? So the fluid type was recognized as one of the key kinds of representatives, and the wellbore status and the fluid direction. And the work group created two symbols, essentially. They created a symbol intended to represent the fluid type, and then an overlay symbol to represent a wellbore that was injecting, suspended, shut in, or abandoned. And they pushed this out to the membership over a period of time to see what kind of acceptance we got. We got pretty good acceptance. And we talked to the folks at ESRI and asked the ESRI folks to give this symbol set to their guys that are usability experts. And our question was, are these symbols going to be visibly usable and sensible for a user, and is it something that we can easily use in a GIS? And they had some recommendations. If you look at the symbol under gas, cycle gas, injecting, and gas, it's a circle with spider legs and an arrow, and there's a very tiny little letter in that arrow. And they took a look at that letter and said, we don't think that letter is going to be visible. Why did you pick a letter? And the reason the work group picked a letter was because they wanted to create a plot symbol set that was just black and white. They didn't want to use any colors. And the ESRI folks came back and said, really, you need to use color. There are very few people now who can't accommodate color, and we can set up the color so that the grayscale plotting is probably going to be sufficiently representative. And they came back to us with an alternate plot symbol set that you can see now, using essentially the same symbols for the fluid types and similar symbols for the wellbore status, but they came up with a yellow symbol and a green symbol to represent the fluid direction. So that's where we are right now. And in summary, the well status information that I showed you, those decomposite facets, have been up for review by industry, and they're up for review by anybody in industry. So if anybody who's listening wants to participate in that project, reach out to me, and I'd be glad to get you hooked up. Everything's going up on our LinkedIn site. It's all available on our website. You can comment on the terms. You can comment on the definitions. You can comment on the plot symbols once we get the status, the facets reviewed. And then all this information is going to be publicly available, and we'll make it available to everybody as well through the ESRI web interfaces as well, since they are the #1 GIS, and anybody else as well. But what we found is that by decomposing that very complex information and attaching definitions to this information, the information becomes much more usable and easier to query, and it helps us to highlight and resolve areas where we have terminology that in industry is still used very inconsistently. So terms like suspended and shut in have highly variable definitions in industry, and we can see that now that we've done the decomposition, and we can go back to the people who originate those definitions and begin the work of trying to get industry to be more convergent in their use of those terminologies. We also have found we got better communication, much better queryability in our data systems, and much improved ability to take information within an organization and make it available to multiple user groups within that organization, so that we've got a common framework. So when I showed this information to an organization in the U.S. called the Groundwater Protection Council, the Groundwater Protection Council is an affiliation of the producing states in the U.S. So it is the data managers, GIS people, etc., from the producing states in the U.S., and they're using this information as a Rosetta Stone to help them to come to convergence on the way their well status information is being conveyed, and that's a good step in the direction of providing more harmonized national reporting at a U.S. level. And so that project is moving forward as well. We do recognize that in this information there are some gaps, and we're looking to industry to help us to resolve those gaps. And as I said, all of that work's being done online. Anybody can contribute anytime. The work is 100% on the website, so if you want to participate, jump on in and let us know what you think. And with that, thanks very much for your attention. I do have a few extra slides that I've hidden in this presentation, but I'll send the presentation to Talbot, and he'll make it available to you as well. And the next slides just contain the names of all the facets and their definitions, just in case you want to look at them for reference later. Talbot, that's it.
Wow, that was fantastic, Trudy. You know, a lot of people, myself included, grump that talking and listening about standards is about as exciting as watching paint dry, but the realization that standards really enable functionality and the usefulness of data is a resounding message, and I can see you've tackled a very tricky issue that has a lot of different, forgive the pun, facets to it, and developed a consensus-driven standard. So first question is, how can folks get involved? You mentioned some of the activities, but is there a website or a telephone number? Just how do they jump into this?
There is a website, and let me just see if I can. I'm using Windows 8. Is anybody here in love with Windows 8? because it's not me.
Not as popular as Windows ME was.
Oh, yeah, I remember that one. Okay, so it's wellstatus.ppdm.org.
So wellstatus.ppdm.org.
Right, so here's the website, and you do have to log in, and the reason you have to log in is you have to accept an agreement that allows us to use your contributions. If we were to allow somebody to contribute to this work and not accept an agreement, we wouldn't have a clear line of IP to give back to industry, and there would be risk of lawsuits. The blah is all boring legal stuff, but that's why you have to create an ID, but you don't have to be a member of PPDM to participate in this work. So if I go into this website, having done that, I can pick whichever facet I want, and you can see here that all the definitions and terms are here. And if you have a comment, you can make a comment, and you can also get into all these facets, and you can vote on whether or not you like these. Do you like the name? Do you like the definition? Vote them thumbs up and down. And the more people who do this, the better. Right? So I see somebody doesn't like that term, absence of fluid, so we need to come up with some different recommendations. So this is available to anybody, and I really do invite you to participate in this work. The plot symbols will be available for us to comment and vote, but the first thing we have to nail down is the facets and the terms and their definitions. And we're going through those at about 1 a week, and we should be done that, I think, at the end of January or thereabouts. We're going through them pretty quickly. They're almost done, so you don't have much longer to get that done. And then we'll start working on the plot symbology.
Hey, that's fantastic. Hey, a question from me. One of the papers I presented recently, and it's kind of an industry grump, is that we'll use attributes in a table to describe a feature and then drive the symbology using those attributes. But I see very seldom that a code is actually created across a vertical market or an industry that would indicate either the symbol to be used from a standard library or be able to get linked to how to construct, put different elements around a symbol, etc. Have you all given any thought to like numeric values to match the different symbols and symbol structures that you're using?
That's a really good question. It kind of gets you into the area of primary keys, and as a data modeler, I'll tell you that's a holy grail. So I don't want to make anybody really angry with us, but the ability to attach codes and values to these representations is important. Some of that work has been done, but it hasn't all been done. Mostly what we're looking for in this early phase is to get complete clarity. So we've been working really hard on spelling everything out, using whole words, whole sentences to make sure that we're communicating really clearly. And some of these values do have codes, but as you can see, the one that I'm looking at right now, the facet value, this one doesn't.
Okay.
All right. We might.
And there's some folks who would love to see this presentation at the PUG meeting this coming year. And so we'll encourage you.
You're talking about the ESRI GIS conference?
Yeah, I believe so.
Yeah, I have given this talk previously at the GIS conference, but I'd be happy to do it again. I'm hoping that by the time that conference rolls around, we'll be most of the way done with the plot symbology, and the facet definition should be done.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
That's fantastic. I have a paper at the ESRI, and I think they've accepted it, so I'll be there.
Okay, great. Are there any other questions or comments? Well, with that, we thank you for an absolutely wonderful presentation. And for those who are still on the line, we can encourage you strongly enough to please visit www.gita.org, not only to retrieve a recording of this presentation, but please join. It's your membership that makes presentations like this possible, and we need an active and viable membership to keep this content alive. So again, we thank you very much for your time and effort, and thanks to all of our audience who took time out of their busy day to listen in. That's all for today's presentation, and look for our next one in the new year on the new geospatial platform that's been launched by the Federal Geographic Data Committee. So long for now, and have a happy holidays. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.